Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Huria Amir, Head of Physiology Department, Faisalabad Medical University. Today's lecture is about the cortical and brainstem control of motor functions. And this is actually including the chapter 56 of Chitin. Now let's talk about them one by one. First of all, we are going to talk about the motor cortex and corticospinal tract. Now the functional areas of the cerebral cortex, they include the motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. Now what are and where are these areas are? That is the first one, motor cortex. That is lying anterior to the central cortical sulcus, the posterior 1/3 of the frontal lobes. So this area is actually making the motor cortex, the part interior to the central cortical sulcus, including the posterior 1/3 of frontal lobe is the motor cortex. Then we have the somatosensory cortex. It lies posterior to the central sulcus and it feeds the motor cortex many signals which initiate the motor activities. Now motor cortex, it is divided into three sub-areas, which are number one, the primary motor cortex, the premotor area, the supplementary motor area. Each has its own representation of muscle groups and specific motor functions. You can see the area which is anterior to the central sulcus, including the posterior 1/3 of the frontal lobe, that is actually making the motor cortex. And it is actually comprising of three areas, which are primary motor cortex, the supplementary area, and the premotor area. Whatever information that is coming from the somatic area 1, that is the sensory areas, they are going to go to the information is to be given to the motor areas, and then the execution of activity occurs. So this diagram is a must for all of you to draw in your logbook, which is making us clear about the location of different areas in the cortex. You can see primary motor cortex, supplementary motor area, the premotor cortex, and posterior to the central sulcus there is somatosensory cortex, posterior parietal cortex. Primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex lies in the first convolution of the frontal lobes anterior to the central sulcus. It begins laterally in the sylvian fissure, spreads superiorly to the uppermost portion of the brain, and then it dips deep into the longitudinal fissure. More than half of it controls the muscles of hand and muscles of speech. Excitation of a single motor cortex neuron usually excites a specific movement rather than one specific muscle. So you can say that it is very much important regarding the execution of different type of movements which involve group of muscles. You can see the primary motor cortex, which is lying just anterior to the central sulcus. Again, you can see that there is presence of a motor homunculus. What is this motor homunculus? This is actually a distorted human figure which is not showing the exact configuration of normal human body, but it is actually showing the different parts which are hypothetically drawn according to their level of presentation over there in the primary motor cortex. So it is a distorted image in which there is large hand size, there is small leg size, there is large face size. Why? Because the accuracy of movements and the area which is actually being given representation over here in the primary cortex is quite high. You can see this is the homunculus, and you are all going to be asked in examination, what is this homunculus? You can see that there is a distorted hypothetical representation figure of human body which is over there in the cortex. We have a primary homunculus, a hypothetical diagram. We have sensory homunculus diagram which is hypothetical. Now premotor area. Now what is this? The premotor area lies 1 to 3 cm anterior to the primary motor cortex, inferiorly into the sylvian fissure and superiorly into the longitudinal fissure. It joins the supplementary motor area and has similar functions. The organization of the premotor cortex is roughly the same as that of the primary motor cortex. Mouth and face areas located most laterally. As one moves upward, the hand, arm, trunk, and leg areas are encountered. Nerve signals generated in the premotor area cause much more complex patterns of movements than the discrete patterns generated over there in the primary motor cortex. The pattern may be to position the shoulders and arms so that the hands are properly oriented to perform specific tasks. The most anterior part of the premotor area first develops a motor image of the total muscle movement that is to be performed. In the posterior premotor cortex, this image excites each successive pattern of muscle activity required to achieve the image. The posterior part of the premotor cortex sends its signals either directly to primary motor cortex to excite specific muscles or often by way of the basal ganglia and thalamus back to the primary motor cortex. Again, the same picture. You can see the location of premotor cortex. Now another term, mirror neurons. In the premotor cortex, mirror neurons become active when a person performs a specific motor task or when he or she observes the same task performed by others. So the concept of mirror neurons, that is important. These neurons mirrors the behavior of another person as though the observer was performing the specific motor task, transform sensory representations of acts heard or seen into motor representations of these acts. Probably the mirror neurons may be important for understanding the actions of other people and for learning new skills by imitation. The premotor cortex, basal ganglia, thalamus, and primary motor cortex, they constitute a complex overall muscle system for the control of complex patterns of coordinated muscle activity. Then there is presence of another supplementary motor area. The supplementary motor area has different organization for the control of motor function. It lies mainly in the longitudinal fissure but extends a few centimeters onto the superior frontal cortex. Contractions elicited by stimulating this area are often bilateral rather than unilateral. Stimulation leads to bilateral grasping movements of both hands simultaneously, so we can say that the synchrony of both the sides of the body is actually attributed to this area. This area functions along with the premotor area to provide body-wide attitudinal movements, fixation movements of the different segments of the body, body-wide attitudinal movements, positional movements of the head and eyes, finer motor control of the arms and hands. So you can see how these three areas, they are working in collaboration, in coordination, in order to have the synchrony and you can say the balance, as well as the exact coordination of the movements. Some specialized areas of the motor control in human motor cortex. A few highly specialized motor regions of the human cerebral cortex, they control specific motor functions. And the important regions, they are Broca's area, voluntary eye movement field, head rotation area, and area for hand scales. You can see a few highly specialized motor regions of the human cerebral cortex controlling specific motor functions. You can see Broca's area, word formation area over there in the lower portion of the frontal lobe. You can see the hand scale areas, then head rotation areas, the contralateral eye movements areas. They are lying there over there in the human cerebral cortex. Broca's area. Now, what is Broca's area? A premotor area, a word formation area which is lying anterior to the primary motor cortex and above the sylvian fissure, is the Broca's area. Now, what happens if the damage to this, it does not prevent a person from vocalizing but makes it impossible for the person to speak the whole words, rather than uncoordinated utterness or in occasionally simple words like no or yes. A closely associated cortical area also causes appropriate respiratory function, so a respiratory activation of vocal cords can occur simultaneously with the movements of mouth and tongue during speech. Voluntary eye movement field. In the premotor area immediately above Broca's area is a locus for controlling voluntary eye movements. Damage to this area prevents a person from voluntarily moving the eyes toward different objects. The eyes tend to lock involuntarily onto specific objects, an effect controlled by signals from the occipital visual cortex. This frontal area also controls eyelid movements, which is blinking. Head rotation area. Slightly higher in the motor association area, there is electrical stimulation eliciting the head rotation. This area is closely associated with the eye movement field and it directs the head towards different objects. Then there is area for hand scales. In the premotor area, immediately anterior to primary motor cortex for hand and finger, is a region for hand scales. The tumors or other lesions in this area leading to inappropriate movements of hand like which are uncoordinated, unpurposeful, and leading to motor apraxia. Then we should know about the corticospinal or pyramidal tracts, the transmission of signals from motor cortex to muscles, that is by means of corticospinal pyramidal tracts. Now what happens is that the corticospinal tract, they are being produced by 40% portion of primary motor cortex. Then we have premotor area and supplementary cortex. and they're going to pass through the internal capsule, then to the midbrain, then to the pons, and